This is an A-level biology presentation looking at gas exchange in mammals. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at the structure of the human gas exchange system, and we're going to be looking at describing the process of gas exchange. To get started, look back at your memory from GCSE and see how many of the labels you can add in. Hopefully you can add in them all. If you don't know them all, that's fine, but you do have to memorize them very quickly. Preferably before you go any further through the presentation, as you're going to find it hard to describe the process if you don't know which bit of the system we're talking about. So pause the presentation now, and when you're ready you can restart. So let's go through the answers. To start with, we have the trachea, and we have the rings of cartilage around the trachea. You should know the trachea from GCSE. You may know about the rings of cartilage. The next label is what we've got of the ribs. Between the ribs, we have what are called intercostal muscles. You may not be aware of that from GCSE. You also have what's called a bronchus. Bronchi is when we talk about more than one bronchus is the singular, and you have two bronchus, one going to one lung and one going to the other lung. We've got the bronchioles, which are the tubes that as we go through the lung, we start getting into smaller and smaller tubes. The bronchus is the first coming off from the trachea, and then the bronchioles are slightly smaller. They then lead to what are called alveoli. And alveoli are little cauliflower-shaped structures found at the end of a bronchiole, and that is the site of gas exchange. The last thing at the bottom is a muscle which is known as the diaphragm. What you have to do is you've descriptions on the left hand side. You've got to get those descriptions and then match them to the relevant structure on the right. Pause the presentation now, come up with the best answers you can, and then when you're ready, restart the presentation. Well, the lobe structures, or the lungs, when we talk about rings of cartilage, we talk about the trachea. We're talking about tubes of cartilage that produce mucus. We're going a bit further down into the bronchi. When we start going to a series of tubes lined with epithelial cells, we're moving on to the bronchioles, and of course the smaller sacs of the alveoli. What you've got is a diagram showing what happens during the mechanism of breathing in and breathing out. Please don't talk about respiration. It gets far too confusing when you talk about respiring and the chemical process. So we talk about inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation, of course, is breathing in, and exhalation, of course, is breathing out. What you've been given is statements A through G, and they fit in between the arrows on the diagram. Notice that we have actions occurring at the intercostal muscles and at the diaphragm at exactly the same time, and then that leads through to one process, ultimately resulting in inhalation. Don't worry about writing out the statement, simply use letters A to G and try and work out the sequence of events that happens. When you're ready, you can then restart the presentation and go through your answers. And let's have a look at some answers. Well, in terms of intercostal muscles, we have to be able to talk about the fact that we have external intercostal muscles contracting. And that's an important point for A level. We've got to talk about external intercostal muscles. When they do that, the rib cage moves up and out. What we also have is the diaphragm, and the diaphragm contracts, it becomes flat. Now you can cheat in the exam. You can of course put your hands on your ribs, take a big deep breath in, and that will help you give a little bit of information and hopefully help your memory. When the diaphragm flattens and the rib cage moves up and out, what we do is we increase the volume of the thorax. Remember, the thorax is everything inside the pleural cavity, which is all of the breathing system. When we increase the volume of the thorax, we are actually decreasing the pressure. And we decrease it compared to the pressure in the atmosphere around us. And because the atmosphere around us has gas at a higher pressure than inside our lungs, the inhalation occurs. Air moves in because of the pressure change. There's no suction, It is literally the difference in pressures that causes the gas to move in. Next thing you have to do is think about the statement you've got in front of you and how would that change when we're talking about exhalation. So again, pause the presentation, try and work out what would happen when we, instead of breathe in, we breathe out, and then restart when you're ready to check your answers. So pause now. Well, when it comes to breathing out or exhalation, what we talk about now is internal intercostal muscles. We talk about the fact that the diaphragm muscles relax. As it relaxes, it pushes up into that dome shape. Because the rib cage has come down and in and the diaphragm is pushed up, we decrease the volume of the thorax. Because we've decreased the volume of the thorax, we've actually increased the pressure inside the lungs. And the air pressure inside the lungs is higher than the air pressure outside the lungs, and as a result the gas moves out and we have exhalation. It is worth noting that there's elastic tissue in the lungs, and that elastic tissue gets stretched when the rib cage moves up and out, and as we relax, the passive retracting of that elastic tissue helps contribute to exhalation. You do need to be aware of the structure of the alveoli. Remember, in the alveoli we have gas exchange occurring. This is where the oxygen moves from the alveoli into the red blood cells. Remember, if you're asked to draw arrows showing where the movement of gas is, if it's oxygen, you have to show it going into the red blood cell. When we talk about gas exchange of carbon dioxide, it moves from the plasma in the capillary and into the alveoli. Again, you may need to go back over your structure of blood vessels and the structure of blood presentation just to refresh your memory. You do have to make sure you talk about a concentration gradient. And the concentration gradient is why CO2 is always moving from the capillaries into the alveoli, and O2 is always moving from the alveoli into the blood capillaries. Remember, all the adaptations of the alveoli all connect up with Fick's law. Remember, Fick's law is the fact that the rate of diffusion is proportional to surface area times concentration difference, all divided by the distance of the diffusion pathway. In terms of alveoli, there are a number of adaptations that make it very, very good at gas exchange. The obvious one is the structure of the alveoli to increase the surface area. We talk about the fact that the alveoli are very thin. They're only one cell thick in their walls, one lining of epithelial cells. We need to talk about the fact that they've got an excellent blood supply. It's a network of capillaries, not just one capillary going past each of the alveoli. Remember, if you're asked to explain, you've got to describe what it is, large surface area, and then explain how it increases the rate of diffusion, because a high surface area increases the rate of diffusion. If we talk about the thin walls, we talk about reduction of the diffusion pathway. And if we talk about the fact that it has a large capillary network, we can link that to maintaining a concentration gradient or concentration difference, and maximizing that increases the rate of diffusion. Remember, red blood cells can travel very slowly, one cell at a time, through capillaries, but it is not an adaptation of an alveoli. That is an adaptation of blood capillaries, so just be careful of what the question says. If it talks about alveoli, talk about alveoli. It's unlikely that you're going to be asked a specific question on the exam about the pleural cavity, but it is worth noting that it's there and what it does. The pleural cavity is a double membrane layer with fluid filled in between, and it's a separator between the ribs and the lungs. And its main function, or one of its main functions, is that it basically provides lubrication so that as tissues and other body parts are moving, that they don't actually get damaged in the mechanisms of breathing. As I said, you're not going to get a question on the pleural cavity specifically, but it may be incorporated under another question, and you should just be aware of it. Just to finish off, all you have to do is you've got Couple of questions, they're true or false. Work your way through. Whenever you're ready, you can restart the presentation and check your answers. So pause now. So the answers are as follows. The terms breathing and respiration is the same thing. Absolutely not. Please don't use them. It's very, very difficult sometimes to not talk about respiring and things like that, but talk about the breathing system. It just stops all the complications. When we breathe out, the rib muscles contract and the volume of the thorax increases. Well, if you're not sure, put your hands on your ribs. Big deep breath in and then breathe out. When you breathe out, what's happening to the volume? Well, if you do that, you should find that that statement is false. And if you take a big deep breath in, you should find that the volume of the thorax is increasing. When we breathe out, the diaphragm muscle relaxes. Well, remember, stretching it out is what happens when it contracts. So relaxes is when it gets into that dome shape. So as a consequence, when we're breathing out, do we want that dome shape pushing onto the lungs, increasing the pressure in the lungs? Well, yes, we do. Gas exchange occurs at the alveoli, 100% true. When we breathe out, the carbon dioxide level in the air exhaled has decreased. Well, no, it has not. Of course, the carbon dioxide levels in the air exhaled has increased when we breathe out. And when we breathe out, the oxygen level in the air exhaled is decreased. Well, that is absolutely true because that oxygen has been absorbed into our red blood cells.